Hello and welcome to session 311 in the AISafety.com reading group. Tonight we'll be discussing I Read Every Major AI Labs Safety Plan So You Don't Have to by Sarah Hasting Woodhouse. Before we start, a few words about the framing. Sarah read the plans to not kill everyone, so we don't have to. To any observer, this must seem very odd. Is the AI safety community really too lazy to read 50 pages? The labs are surprisingly candid about the stakes. Dario Amodei has a PDOOM of 25%, and the other labs and their CEOs are very explicit about the risks that they're taking on our behalf. And surely the description of the safety plans for such a high-stakes operation ought to be well scrutinized, right? Unfortunately, my conclusion is that Sarah's work is necessary. These documents appear to be the result of a process with very few resources and very little careful thought. I will go further than Sarah and argue that this poor quality is in fact deliberate, because these plans are to some extent a distraction, and that is the reason why we should not read them. I'll argue that these plans are not made because the organizations care, but are instead better conceived as some kind of minimal reaction to external pressure for safety. Sarah's work in comparing these frameworks is useful because they are very different. And I'll argue that their differences fundamentally undermine their effectiveness. I also appreciate her work in analyzing them because they are kind of haphazardly written, and they often engage in this tactic of redefining existing words and concepts. If the reader is hoping for something that looks like a plan in these documents, they will be disappointed. These are preliminary frameworks that will require a lot to be turned into actual plans. Most problematic, I will argue that these do not in fact solve the problem, but they instead gesture towards a future trajectory where we race to the precipice, maybe we break, but we only break when it's far too late. Before we get to the text, I'd like to start by presenting my argument that these frameworks are a response to external pressure. To compress the history of the AI labs, I think it's reasonable to say that their public communications initially emphasized safety to a substantial degree. The promises of safety research in these labs seemed mostly not to be carried through. Maybe 90% of the efforts went into capability. Personally, I lost a lot of trust when the Machine Intelligence Research Institute in 2022 issued a public call for plans, and this was mostly ignored, and there were no plans announced. This led gradually to a more confrontational stance between capability and safety. And so the demands for safety frameworks from policymakers and protesters became the driving force. In particular, in the last week, we've seen Meta release a framework and many other of the smaller labs and DeepMind updating their framework. And this has very clearly and even explicitly been something that they've done in reaction to external pressure. Now that I've set the stage, let's look at what Sarah writes in her article about these plans and their idiosyncrasies. So Sarah restricts her attention to the safety plans of the three frontier labs. I think that was a very reasonable choice, because when she wrote this article, at first it's been updated a couple of days ago, but when it was written, they were the only ones who had something published. I think the largest that has been added has been Meta, so I will also include that. So the first lab is Anthropic with their responsible scaling policy. Anthropic strongly brands themselves on AI safety. Next we have Google DeepMind, which is the original AGI lab And for that reason, they have attracted a lot of people who care about safety. And they have a frontier safety framework. Meta is one of the newest. They are probably the lab with the least focus on safety. Their capabilities are also somewhat, arguably not at the frontier. And they've just published their frontier AI framework. And finally, we have OpenAI, which was initially very safety focused, but appear to be strongly trending away from safety. They published their preparedness framework before the exodus of safety researchers. The labs are epistemically humble in how they describe their frameworks, with the notable exception of Anthropic. Anthropic doesn't hedge as much. They want their framework to be taken seriously in the way that the others, by adding beta, might not. Zvi Mowshowicz makes a joke that there seems to be a law mandating that each of these frameworks must have a unique name. And of course, I appreciate the humor, but I am somewhat less amused, because for all serious safety application, there are laws mandating how to do things in a uniform, standardized way. And this is a kind of meta process that we have come to realize through a process of, well, they say safety regulations are written in blood. And I think this is something that you should not deviate from. So for the record, the title that they should have made, the one that they promised, is the word safety framework. Sarah and probably most people except me, I'm not representing most of the AI safety field here, but Sarah seems to grant these labs the benefit of doubt in this, but I do not, because I perceive this naming to be a part of a pattern. So I recognize that my personal view here seems harsh and confrontational from my side. And in order to mellow this, I think I want to present like an alternative. So my alternative here, I want to hang a lampshade on my actual alternative. My actual alternative is don't build this, but these frameworks are obviously written by people who don't see AI as risky as me. So even if you thought AI was risky but not that risky, what would you do? Well, this here is Rohin Shah, a researcher of DeepMind, a prominent researcher, and most of these frameworks are anonymous, but DeepMind is not, and he has his name on this. So it feels a bit bad picking on him, because signing your work is a virtue. So I think more people should do that. Okay, hypothetically, Rohin could ask me, Søren, can you make a better framework than we've just did, right? I think that's a fair question. He hasn't actually asked me this in reality. And I think he should, because part of the reason why these frameworks suffer is probably because they haven't sought out sufficient feedback. I think you should absolutely ask, even though, of course, asking in this kind of process does require substantially more resources. So what would I say? My central point is that the framework DeepMind is presenting should be replaced by simply saying, we will do like OpenAI, instead of presenting their own framework. This would mean that there would be fewer frameworks, so we could put much more effort into analyzing a single framework. Both they could do that, and the AI safety community externally could do that. It would also mean that other labs would have an easy shelling point, which could potentially eventually coalesce into some kind of formal agreement or even an international treaty, right? From a game theoretic perspective, this seems much more likely to avoid kind of a race to the bottom. It avoids a lot of mistakes and confusions. And this is what I think they should do. Of course, there's a sliding scale between saying we'll do precisely this and moving further away from it. And in the extreme, you could have completely dissimilar frameworks. And if each lab had a completely dissimilar framework, the combination would provide almost no meaningful level of safety because in almost all situations that would be one lab which would not stop. Of course, this is sidestepping kind of the elephant in the room, which is whether these labs would actually follow these policies. I think this is probably out of scope for here because there's enough problems in these policies, and this is what we're going to focus on here. To compare the three safety plans or policy or frameworks, SARA attempts to extract a common structure from them. This is the work that I think shouldn't be necessary, or at least it shouldn't be hard. But as we'll see, the three labs have made this task really difficult. And her work in comparing them and also this presentation skips over a lot of details. That's necessary, but it also feels like a lot of these differences and different choices they've made seem very inconsequential. For this reason, I think this presentation will contain errors and probably more errors than usual. And you should of course blame me for my errors, but to the extent that I'm arguing that these policies are obscurantist, then I think it is more correct to blame the labs. In SARA's presentation, a central element of these policies is the capability evaluations. How do the labs operationalize how strategically capable a given model is? The second element is how do the lab establish some threshold? What levels of extinction risk and other damages are acceptable for the labs? The third element is mitigations. What concrete steps do the labs intend to take to achieve their goal of reducing the risk? SARA does some work at organizing these into a common, coherent process. And while she's doing that, she's arguably making DeepMind's work seem better than it is in that process. A central problem for her and for us is that these organizations use a bewildering array of safety categories. And so in this presentation, I've tried to standardize them to a greater extent than SARA did. I've also tried to consistently present the four labs in alphabetic order, which I think for myself helps clarify the overall picture. At least it helps for me. Let's start with goals, because goals are central to plans for any definition. So let's start by looking at the goals as described by these labs. Anthropic describes the purpose of their responsible scaling policy as a commitment to not train dangerous models. The purpose described by DeepMind is more vague, and it's mostly about identifying future capabilities. Meta has a very limited goal. They are focusing on specific concrete catastrophes, and they're only doing that to the extent that Meta can be directly held responsible for these catastrophes. OpenAI's preparedness framework is broader, with a goal of forecasting and preventing catastrophic risks. SARA seems to hold this greater concreteness as a point in favor of Anthropic. And that makes sense, right? Being more concrete seems obviously desirable, right? I think I disagree here. The purpose of a safety plan is safety in general, and avoiding training dangerous models is a very small part of that. And so Anthropic's plan allows them to race as quickly as possible to the precipice and then stop, right? And that's ignorant of the fact that inertia will just easily take us over the edge. But I also feel like SARA and probably I am harder on Anthropic than some of the others, because Anthropic is giving some kind of outward signal that they care and that they listen to criticism, and they may in fact change their policies. So that's why I talk more about that than I do about Meta, who seem less genuine. The capability levels are given different names by the organizations. Anthropic takes inspiration from the containment of biological viruses in their naming schemes, choices that result in like AI safety level 1 through 4. That's a pretty bizarre choice because AI like capability research is very different from a virus. This choice also caused them to start their levels at an extremely low level, with ASL1 being models that can't do anything really. DeepMind, they have separate critical capability levels for each domain of capability. And some of their levels aren't really named. This seems overly complicated. As far as I can tell, the mitigations really don't rely on distinguishing by the domain. So I think DeepMind's could be dramatically simplified. Meta tries hard to distinguish risk level and capability level. This is odd to me because I think the central problem is that the intelligence of the model and the level of risks that a model represents are really tightly related. You can't really distinguish between the two. OpenAI don't talk about capability levels, but they only talk about risk levels, so that's fine again. They categorize them as low, medium, high, and critical. Low is for historical systems, so I think they should just straight up omit that. But otherwise, I think an OpenAI's naming scheme is pretty sane. So I considered, in order to standardize this, to convert like the other labs to the OpenAI system, but I decided to like introduce my own standard with 3 levels. Like there's the current level, the levels that's worrisome, and dangerous levels. And I'll try to sort them according to this. So if we're following my naming scheme, let's look at the current capability level. Where are we now? How dangerous do the frontier labs think that their models currently are? Anthropic is currently on ASL-2, which they define as about as dangerous as a search engine. So in practice, by saying that Claude is as intelligent as a search engine, they're basically saying it's totally safe. And this is obviously wrong. Like anyone who has interacted with these models know that they are in fact much smarter than a search engine, right? You really have to wonder, is that incompetence? Is it malice? Maybe they just haven't updated it. Like they're not saying that the current level is the lowest possible, but that's just because they have the silly ASL1 level below the current level 2. DeepMind doesn't explicitly give a name to the current level of capabilities, but they argue that their models are no more useful for creating harms than the internet at large. Like my expectations of DeepMind are pretty low, and I think I'll just straight up label that as dishonest and move on. Meta is also very unclear about what the current capability level is, but from the risk level, I think they think it's moderate, but like they're stating that they don't think that these models provide any significant uplift to the to bad actors. I'm somewhat more reluctant to call Meta dishonest than calling DeepMind dishonest, because I think Meta is plausibly just incompetent, whereas DeepMind has a lot of people who really ought to know better. OpenAI, in contrast, believes that the current level has a medium risk, where the models are a real help for bad actors. And again, I think OpenAI's beta framework comes out looking better, though their assessment obviously by now is pretty dated. That was the current level. Now let's go to the level that I call the worrisome level. What happens if a model starts to become capable of strategic action? Sarah emphasizes that the policies and frameworks are really vague on what evaluations would trigger any kind of action. However, there is some amount of details about what would happen once a model starts to appear like it could cause harm. Unfortunately, these mitigations seem to focus a lot on cybersecurity, and in particular ensuring that competitors don't steal their models instead of actually mitigating the risk of harm. Anthropic will, if they suspect that a model can be misused to cause severe harm, make it robust against misuse and then deploy it. One thing they don't say is that they will pause. None of the labs really say that they will pause under any circumstances at the worrisome level, at least as far as I can tell. DeepMind claim they would fine-tune their models to be safer first and then deploy them. Sarah points out, and I agree, that DeepMind is really vague about precisely what actions they would take. Meta distinguishes between capability and risk. And for this reason, they argue that they can make very capable models non-risky through the employment of some specific named techniques. As far as I can tell, there's no real safety research behind any of their claims. So when they talk about, geogating and sanctions and things like that, I think it might as well be like made up words. OpenAI claim they would train the worrisome model, but not deploy them. And that seems correct in my estimates. Again, OpenAI is doing well, and I think perhaps the higher quality is because it was created before all the safety people at OpenAI left in protest. Now let's get to the third level. After current worrisome, now the level that I call dangerous. The labs call them things as ASL-4, critical capability level 2, critical risk. So what capabilities will these policies eventually result in? This part of the frameworks, to me, read more like roadmaps, like expected consequences of these policies. They are moving towards this level, and it's really sobering reading. If some of these capabilities are achieved, I think we will be in a situation where humanity will really be at the mercy of these AIs. Anthropic, for once, doesn't have any analysis at all about the level where they would stop. You could say this is internally consistent because they have a policy that says their model is no smarter than a search engine. So from that point, if that is their belief, then it makes sense to just postpone talking about ASL level 4 if you're at ASL level 2, right? But this is, of course, wildly irresponsible. Like their CEO has publicly stated that he expects to reach this level this year. DeepMind expects some capabilities, including fully automated AI research and a level of cyber attacks that humanity will really be unable to resist without AI assistance. And I think we ought to pause for a moment and consider what such a world would really look like. Because even if DeepMind, once they've reached this level of capabilities, do not deploy them, well, somebody else will. And in that case, we should expect that humanity will be powerless. Meta forecasts that their models will eventually be able to create high-impact novel biological weapons. And this is presented in kind of neutral clinical language, which does nothing to evoke the horrific consequences of this capability. OpenAI's vision is also extremely bleak, including such grim capabilities as the ability to persuade anyone to act against their own interests, and many others, right? It's not really clear what the point of discussing this level even is, because the level that is actually dangerous is much lower, right? It takes much less than these capabilities to take over the world. And we should really not follow a set of policies that predictably ends with this. Now let's go to a less strategic area, like how updated are these policy documents and the system cards of the models? Sarah is making the claim that all the frontier labs have published system cards for the most advanced model. I will be double checking this, but of course we're a bit more than 2 months after Sarah made this claim, so while it was maybe not strictly true back then, it is certainly much less true now. Anthropic published the first version of their policy 504 days ago, and they updated 114 days ago. And the last system card was for Sonnet 231 days ago. That's not their most capable model. It's called Opus. It was published before this article. It made a splash when Anthropic violated their commitment to not advance the frontier of capabilities. DeepMind published their framework like 265 days ago, but they recently updated it. They have a system card for Gemini 1.5, which is 100 days old, but again, there's no system card for Gemini 2.0. DeepMind also made a promise to publish the actual evals that they would use. They made that promise 623 days ago, and we're still waiting. Meta published their framework a couple of days ago, but they made the promise to make this framework almost a year ago. OpenAI made their framework first, and they called it a living document, but it hasn't been updated for the subsequent 416 days. There is a system card for O1, but there is no system card for O3, their most capable model. I don't really think this is malice. I think it's just a natural consequence of the fact that safety is a very low priority for these frontier labs. Sarah's analysis and, of course, to a lesser extent, the analysis made by these very, very resourceful companies, like billion-dollar outfits, has a consideration of the domains of strategic capability that are required for causing harm. So I've gone one step further than Sarah and compared the domain-based analysis in her work with the domains described in the standard textbook Superintelligence Path Danger Strategies by Nick Bostrom. The first strategic capability is intelligence amplification, perhaps the most classic and well-known domain. It is completely absent from Anthropic, Meta, and OpenAI's analysis. DeepMind gives a central role to this capability. I can speculate that this is more salient to them because their explicit stated goal is to build this kind of capability, to like replace the AI safety researchers and replace everyone. The second is strategizing. It's mostly absent, but both Anthropic and OpenAI consider OpenAI as an important, consider autonomy an important capability. There's no real argument to this. The texts are pretty brief. And I suppose if you squint, like autonomy is a subset of strategizing. DeepMind used to do this, but they recently removed that and updated their framework to explicitly consider deception. And deception is a pretty big part of strategizing. Hacking, hacking is more than just cybersecurity, but cybersecurity is a pretty big part. And I think this is salient for the labs because their mitigations mostly are restricted to cybersecurity. The fourth is social manipulation. It's only considered relevant by OpenAI, but they consider the subdomain persuasion really quite important. Technological development is mostly absent. Like there's a tiny bit about the models helping with like scary sounding terrorist attacks. You could arguably put that into this category. And the final strategic cognitive domain, economic productivity, is totally absent. What do we make of this kind of incomplete analysis? Like they've obviously read the book, they know about this, and even if they hadn't, then Anthropic must have read OpenAI's policy, right? So Anthropic must have known that OpenAI considers persuasion important. So I'm unsure about precisely what to make about this. I also kind of feel obligated to that. I personally consider these capabilities to be very strongly related. So I totally don't think this is a big problem, but inside the framing where these policies are operating, I think it ought to be something that they ought to be really worried about. Sarah points out that OpenAI specifically explicitly consider these capabilities disjunctive, and just one dangerous capability makes the entire model dangerous. I was surprised to hear that the others didn't. I tried to read the policies to figure out to what extent they did. I couldn't really find a clear answer, so I'm kind of assuming that Sarah is right on this. Another point that Sarah talks about and analyzes is the status of these safety plans. Sarah defends calling them safety plans in her title, like I read the safety plans, because that's what they are widely referred to by others. I think this is a bit unfair, since the labs that publish them call them policies and frameworks. And Sarah makes the point that has other people have also made, that these are very much not plans in any meaningful sense of the word. I actually, more than a year ago, made a post on Less Wrong with a specific criticism of these plans, arguing that they fail the desiderata that's captured in the acronym SMART. Sarah tentatively suggests that you could consider this a plan to eventually make a plan, but like from a technical and perhaps somewhat pedantic point of view, they are not even plans to make a plan. And not even like the concept of a plan or something like that. So Miri made the public challenge in 2022 to the labs to present an actual plan for how we survive. And they didn't respond. And I think we have these frameworks, but it's at this point pretty clear that there is no plan. Now we come to a footnote in Anthropic's policy that Sarah calls the get out of RSP for free card. And that is that Anthropic reserves the right to disregard this policy if, for instance, they believe a less safe organization is close to making dangerous AI. This isn't very surprising to me because all these frameworks are very much not legally binding, and there's no hint of any kind of movement towards making them legally binding. Sarah appreciates and highlights this frankness from Anthropic in comparison to DeepMind and OpenAI. But I'm much more hesitant here because these kind of commitments to safety require a level of trust where formal contracts matter less, and these kind of potential escape clauses might be better left unsaid. Sarah doesn't say, but she motions towards the idea that a plan to do the things that have the best consequences ought to lead to better outcomes than other plans. But to me, this is a naive version of consequentialism that reliably leads to bad consequences. The ontology enables policy documents to enable coordination. But the full implications of having loopholes in a commitment to not raise would require a substantial analysis that I haven't done. My intuitive sense is that this is a bad choice. Meta has a similar get out of RSP free clause that states that they won't mitigate risks that are not unique to their models. And I think like it's very, very clear, and I think it's there's no way this clause is an accident. Sarah ends with 2 points. The first is on the puzzling terminology that is used by these frontier labs. So when the papers and frameworks talk about acceptable risk, they're using acceptable in a way that basically everybody else would disagree with. I agreed, so I tried to look at, okay, how do they define it? How do they write this? To try to like look up the labs, but I couldn't really compress their ideas and anything. Like it's, again, maybe I'm not able to find it in this document because I'm stupid, or maybe this is written in a way that is kind of obscurantist. And I think, unfortunately, this adversarial redefinition of words is one of the key strategies employed by these labs, because we've seen similar redefinitions, in particular for the term AI safety, but also for alignment and general intelligence, human level intelligence, and many other things. So my conclusion is that we shouldn't read these documents because they are a distraction from what actually needs to be done. Sarah might not agree with me, but she does notice her confusion because these documents are strange to her. They are presenting horrific extreme claims as if they are boring, technocratic, ordinary paperwork. And I humbly suggest that this is not a strange coincidence, but a deliberate effect that is designed by the people who authorized these documents. So to summarize, I believe these frameworks are very far from being sufficient, and the absence of actual plans, our only sane course of action is to pause AI. This concludes my presentation on I read every major AI lab safety plan so you don't have to by Sarah Hastings Woodhouse. Thank you for your attention and see you on the 27th of February. Ceterum censeo machinam sapientam esse delendam.